Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to introduce Tony Ulwick.
David, thanks so much. I certainly appreciate it. So let me get our slide deck up here and going. Yeah, we've been at this for about 30 plus years in Strategy. So we're going to be sharing with you today a lot of what we've learned over the years, and we're going to follow it up with a bunch of questions at the end. Is that right, David? We'll have time for Q&A at the back end.
That's it, exactly, yeah.
Great. So let us just jump in. Innovations were quite a common topic these days. When I started in this practice years ago, innovation wasn't even a buzzword yet, but it's really come a long way. With that, of course, comes tons of confusion as well. But I think at the very core of this, there are basics why companies need to innovate. And at the very essence of this, they have to grow, right? And this is what we hear day in and day out from our clients. They need to accelerate growth in core markets. They need to find opportunities to grow in adjacent new markets. They want to be able to launch breakthrough products, create value propositions that resonate strongly with customers, mitigate the risk of failure. I'm sure all of you share these common goals. So it's not surprising then that innovation really is a top priority in nearly every company. It makes one of the top priorities for every CEO's list every year and has for 20 plus years. But despite that, innovation is one of those mystery business processes that just seems like it's difficult to tame. What we're going to do is talk about how to tame innovation as a practice. And at a high level, the answer is quite simple. How do you become great at innovation? Well, what you need is a great innovation process. Now, this is loaded with implications. It means that first off, innovation is a process, and you can come up with a process that makes the output of innovation much more predictable and reliable. Well, let's start by defining what we're talking about by innovation. It is a process. We think about it as the process of devising solutions that address unmet customer needs. It's quite simple. And at a high level, this sounds like it shouldn't be a difficult process to execute. There's only two inputs. We have solutions and needs. But nonetheless, of course, it's complicated across many fronts. I also wanted to point out right up front here that the innovation process has multiple applications during product commercialization. But a lot of people talk about innovation. Sometimes they'll refer to the front end of innovation, where we're talking about what's showing here, which in this case, the goal is to devise a winning product concept up front. So this is what the planners and the strategists do right up front. So they're trying to come up with solutions at a product or platform level that will address unmet customers' needs better than existing solutions. But that's not the only place where innovation occurs throughout the development cycle. Of course, during development, the designers, of course, have to make trade-offs and design decisions to help design a winning product. So this means making it easier to install and set up and interface with and to upgrade and maintain or dispose of and so on. But that's not all either. You have the marketing team who's trying to put together the go-to-market strategy so they can launch the winning product and appeal to the buyer. In that case, too, they're trying to come up with solutions, business models, and so on that will address the customer's unmet needs. So by defining innovation as the process of coming up with solutions that address unmet needs, we can see that there's applications throughout the development cycle in terms of going from the front end all the way through launch and beyond. So with that in mind, let's think about what the goal of innovation is, or a good innovation process. The way we like thinking about this is the ultimate goal is to be able to conceptualize a solution, whether it's a product or a design or a go-to-market strategy, but conceptualize a solution that you know with certainty is going to succeed before it's actually implemented, Now, typically, of course, it's not done that way, which I find quite remarkable. Most innovation efforts really never attempt to try to come up with solutions that address unmet needs in advance of actually developing them. They usually require hypotheses and development, and iteration, and so on. And we call this the ideas first approach to innovation. And generally what's happening here is that, well, you've heard this, I'm sure, many people believe innovation begins with ideas. We would say that's definitely not the case, right? It shouldn't be anyway. Ideas are the output of the innovation process. Solutions are the output of the process. But in the ideas first approach, solutions are conceptualized with a limited understanding of the customer's needs. And again, this approach is usually consistent with making hypotheses and experimenting and guessing and pivoting and iterating, really dependent on luck. And what the innovators generally asking here is, I have an idea. Does the idea address the significant number of unmet needs in a market that's attractive to a company? Well, wouldn't you rather know if you've already picked an attractive market, and wouldn't you rather know what all the customers' unmet needs are and then come up with the solution to address them? I think you probably would, and that takes us to a different approach, because we know the ideas first approach is highly inefficient, it fails to deliver predictable, consistent results. And I would argue that an ideas first approach to innovation will never be better than the alternative, which is the needs first approach to innovation. And this is exactly as it sounds. Let's first understand all the customer's needs, figure out which ones are unmet, determine if there's segments of people with different unmet needs, pick the segments and needs we want to go target with our solution, come up with ideas that will address those, and win in the marketplace. Sounds simple enough. It's marketing 101 logic. But companies trying to do this struggle with innovation as well. And there's a great reason for it. And I'll just ask the question. Is there agreement on your product teams as to what a customer need even is? We hear all this talk about the necessity of satisfying customers' unmet needs, but what we often see, and we've run this poll dozens of times over 30 years, and the answer's been, and still is the same, over 80% of product teams say we don't agree on what a need even is. We have the sales team who thinks needs relate to features and solutions. We have the marketing team that talks about needs as exciters and delighters. We have the development team who talks about them as specifications and requirements. We have others talking about customers that have latent needs they don't know they have and can't articulate. It's really all over the place. We all know we're trying to come up with solutions that address unmet needs, but the problem with innovation is, or I should say it like this, the problem with innovation isn't that customers don't know their needs. The problem is that companies themselves can't agree on what a need is. So this is what we want to take a look at, because you can ask yourself this question, what are the chances that your team will randomly come up with a solution that addresses a half dozen unmet needs in a given segment if it doesn't know that segment exists, if it doesn't know those needs are unmet, and it can't even agree on what a need is? And of course, the answer is pretty low, which you'd argue that this is the reason why many products fail. And if you read those lists of why products fail, always number one on that list is there's a mismatch between what the product does and the customer's needs. And this is why. So what does it take to excel at innovation? Clearly a little different approach, right? A best-in-class proven innovation process that can help companies better understand the customer's unmet needs. And this is what outcome-driven innovation is all about. So we'll take you through the process. It begins with defining the market, then uncovering needs, figuring out which are unmet, discovering segments of people with different unmet needs, and then with that insight, formulating the right strategy for growth. So I'll leave it at that for now, because this sounds like marketing 101, and it is. But we're going to look at marketing 101 through a very different lens and reinvent, if you will, the innovation process. What's unique here is that ODI enables companies to conceptualize solutions they know with certainty will win in the market before implementation begins, right? So before development starts developing the concept, we know that we're focused on a winning product because we know that it's addressing the customer's unmet needs. How do we know that in advance? Well, that's what we're going to figure out. The first time we applied this process was back in the early 1991 timeframe, when I worked with a company called Cordis Corporation in the angioplasty balloon market space. And by understanding the needs through this lens, we were able to reposition their existing products, which led to a 4% increase in market share. We were able to help them introduce 19 new products, all of which became number 1 or 2 in the market, and increase their market share to over 20%. And also to identify an opportunity that was highly underserved, which was minimizing the likelihood of restenosis, which is the recurrence of the blockage, which led to the development of the stent, which was the fastest growing device in medical history. As a result of all this, their stock climbed dramatically over a few year period. They were acquired by J&J. And the beauty of this story is we've been able to repeat this scenario over and over again by following the approach that we'll be describing here today. Bottom line is they knew which outcomes were unmet and to what degree before their solutions were even conceptualized. It's like flipping innovation on its head. Instead of coming up with ideas and testing to see if they meet unmet needs and refining them so they do, we uncover all the customer's needs up front and then devise solutions that address all of them so we know with certainty the ideas will win in the marketplace. This process, as David had mentioned, been battle tested for good 30 plus years across 30 plus industries, over 1,000 different projects. And it works in B2B, B2C, areas where there's a lot of emotion and function, areas where there's little emotion, lots of function, and so on. And we can talk about that. And here's a great example of a company who's used the approach at scale. And what I mean by that is they've not only applied ODI to their products, their outward-facing products, but they've also applied the concepts to internal business process improvement as well, helping internal stakeholders get their jobs done better. And as Clive Beamwell points out here, he says it drove their technology selection, their development priorities, manufacturing strategies, and commercial planning. At a very high level, here are the benefits of the ODI process. Of course, it's a very effective innovation process, and what it allows companies to do is infuse a mindset of innovation that's easy to understand, so everyone's on the same page in terms of what innovation means and how to execute the process. It establishes a common language for innovation, so companies and teams can agree on what a need is. It aligns the team around shared understanding of those needs and what they are, which are unmet, which allows teams to take the guesswork out of the innovation process with something that's more than intuition and gut feel. And as I mentioned already, it has applicability across the entire product commercialization process. The benefit of all this is it increases your chance of success about 5 times. And so we have materials on our website, track record studies to substantiate that if you wanted to go check them out and take a look at them. We put all this in a book. I'll just show it right up front here. It's at jobsbedonebook.com, as you can see, with the link right there. And it's a free ebook. It's free as an ebook. It's free as an audiobook as well. And you can see a few of the academics giving us some nice accolades in regard to what we've been able to achieve over the years. So let's get into the meat of this. What makes the process so powerful? Well, one, of course, it works, but it's also simple, it's disciplined, and it has broad application, as we'll show you. It all begins with taking a different perspective of innovation. And you've probably heard of the concept of jobs to be done. It's based on the notion that people buy products to get a job done. And this is really an economic principle. It's a reality that's been around for centuries. People buy products to get a job done. The way we think about this is that the job can be a task, it can be goals and objectives, situations that companies are trying to resolve or avoid. It's really anything that a group of people are trying to accomplish. And of course, there's tens of thousands of products out there, all designed to help somebody get a job done better. So the goal of innovation then becomes helping people get that job done better and more cheaply. So as an innovator, this is the way you should think. How do we get more of the job done? How do we get it done faster, more predictably with higher output? How can we get it done more cheaply? How can we help people avoid cobbling together multiple solutions so they can buy our solution, come to one place and get the entire job done on a single platform? Well, these are great questions that the innovator should be asking. And in order to do this, they have to have inherently, the way I like saying this, successful innovators either inherently possess or have proactively gained a deep understanding of the customer's job to be done. They do this by changing the unit of analysis. They don't study the customer. They don't study the industry. They don't study the product. What they're studying is the job the customer is trying to get done. They're literally making that the unit of analysis. So that means instead of basing your research on hypotheses and experimentation and testing product features, or studying the buying process, or studying the customer experience, study the job that the customer is trying to get done. Now, I know this sounds simple, but it's really hard to change that kind of mindset. And what we're going to take you through is that journey that will hopefully help you, make that transition from seeing the world through the lens of the company to seeing the world through the lens of what the customer is trying to get done. Again, this is exactly what happens in the ODI process. We define the market, but we're going to define it differently. And I'll explain it in just a minute. We're going to define customer needs, but not in the way you might think. We're going to quantify, to find out what needs are unmet. We're going to segment the market, but not in traditional ways. And through this new lens, you'll be able to come up with solutions that better address the customer's unmet needs. So let's get at this. So for example, while it's obvious that companies serve markets today, across nearly 80% of product teams, there's disagreement on what a market even is. So again, this maybe isn't surprising, because think about it. How does your company define its markets? Around its products, technology, an application, a use case, a vertical, a geography, a demographic. Through a company lens, it's really hard to see how a market should be defined, but through a jobs to be done lens, it becomes much more obvious. Since people buy products and services to get a job done, it follows that a market should be defined as a group of people and the job they're trying to get done. After all, the market has become the unit of analysis. So parents trying to pass on life lessons, for example, constitute a market, or surgeons trying to repair a rotator cuff constitute a market. So defining a market in problem space rather than solution space offers companies this stable long-term focal point around which to create customer value. And that's one of the huge benefits of defining a market through this lens. Because while products come and go, what people are trying to accomplish stays the same over time. I also like to point out here that when you define markets through this lens, it becomes much easier to figure out where there are adjacent markets that you may find attractive. It always concerned me, like people say adjacent markets. Well, adjacent to what? Well, it's adjacent to the market you're in, but how do you define the market that you're in? If you're defining a market as a vertical, is an adjacent market another vertical? If you define your market around a technology, is adjacent another technology? If you define your market around a job to be done, then adjacency can be another job to be done. So you have a current executor that's getting a core job done. What other jobs are they trying to get done? You already own a relationship with this group of people. Maybe you can help them get more jobs done. That's a very natural adjacent market for you to go pursue. Going in the other direction, you can already help people get a job done. Who else is trying to get that exact same job done? Maybe you can find new executors. This would be a logical adjacent market direction to take as well, because you already have a technology that can help them achieve the goals they're trying to achieve. Versus this, which is a new market. A new market is a new job and a new executor. I can't tell you how many times we've been through exercises with companies where they mistakenly think a new market is an adjacent market because of the way they define a market. Again, if you think, if you define your markets as verticals, you may think that going from one vertical to the next is a different market, when in fact, it may be a brand new market, a whole group of people getting a different job done. And this is a mistake companies often make when they're trying to figure out where to grow from the core. Well, moving on from there, the same thing is true when we think about customers' needs. Now, we all know that winning products satisfy customers' unmet needs. Yet, according to our research, over 90% of product teams disagree on what a customer need even is. So again, this too shouldn't be too surprising. Think about this, right? How does your company define its needs? As solutions, benefits, requirements, exciters, delighters, specifications? We could go on, right? Now, through a company lens, it's difficult to understand or to see how to best define a customer need. But again, through a jobs to be done lens, it becomes much more obvious. Since people buy products to get jobs done, we can define needs as the measurable outcomes that people want to achieve when getting a job done. Now, just like when if you were to improve a business process, you're trying to look to see what can I measure and control to produce a predictable output. You try to do the same thing here. You're taking that same concept, but applying it customer facing. They're trying to execute a process. What are they measuring and controlling to ensure predictable output? What should they be measuring and controlling? So when preparing a meal, for example, you may want to minimize the likelihood of over or undercooking the meal. You may want to minimize the time it takes to cook the meal or to clean up. So these are some of your measurable outcomes as examples. So through this lens, people don't have latent needs or needs they can't articulate because we're discussing the problem, we're discussing needs in problem space rather than solution space. And in the space, people like you know what their needs are. So through this lens, needs discovery becomes much more efficient, effective, and simplified. Let me show you an example here. The way I like thinking about this is there's a hierarchy. People trying to get a job done. There's steps in that job. There's outcomes they're trying to achieve across each step of the way. Here's an example from a project we did with surgeons who are trying to remove an anatomical structure surgically. So you can see there's steps along the way, steps 1, 2, and 3, establishing initial access, gaining visual access to the structure, defining the pathway to the structure, navigating through barriers to get to the structure, terminating the blood supply, and so on. So we can go through all the steps, but what I really want you to take a look at are all those statements below. We call these the customer's desired outcomes. So as they're trying to terminate the blood supply to the target structure, for example, we can look at outcome number 25, minimize the time it takes to isolate the blood vessels from the target structure. Then they try to minimize the time it takes to locate the vessel feeding the structure. Minimize the time, the likelihood that bleeding occurs when terminating the blood supply to the structure, and so on. These are very specific instructions coming from the surgeon to the team, describing exactly what they're trying to do along each step of the way. The ultimate goal here of the innovator is to either possess or proactively obtain a deep understanding of the customer's job to be done. And what we're suggesting here is a way to do exactly that. By studying the job as a unit of analysis, by breaking it down step by step, by understanding these measurable outcomes that people are trying to achieve along each step of the way, you now have a set of instructions that comes from the customer, feeds the organization with the inputs they need in order to get the job done better. Think about it this way. Getting the job done better means faster, more predictably, higher output throughput. Every one of these statements relate to one of those three things: making it more predictable, making it more effective, making it faster. And by removing all the factors that are standing in the way of getting the job done perfectly, you can create solutions that get the job done perfectly. These statements follow a very specific format, structure, syntax. We've worked on these for decades and tested many variations of these statements. We call them desired outcomes, hence outcome-driven innovation, because all the solutions and ideas that are generated downstream are instructed from these data points. They come in two formats: either minimize the time it takes to, for example, move an adjacent structure out of the visual field, or minimize the likelihood that, like say, bad things happen, like damaging blood vessels along the path to the structure. So these types of statements allow us to figure out where people are struggling to get the job done faster, more predictably, and with higher output and throughput. So what we're saying is this is the way to define a customer need. And if marketing, sales, development, R&D can agree that this is the way to define a need, they can all use the same inputs to execute on their specific functions. It'll help sales with their sales efforts, marketing with their marketing efforts, and so on. The way I like saying this as well, outcome statements are instructions for value creation, quite literally. They're metrics that can be measured and controlled in the design of the product in terms of the way they're stated. So if you want to minimize the time it takes to do X or Y, as engineers or designers, you can quite literally test solutions against the metric to see if it's getting the job done better or not. And these statements are also stable over time, which is unusual because most needs, people would say, customers' needs change quickly over time. We would say that's not true. What's changing over time are the solutions, the technologies that are available, maybe even the priority order of their needs, but the needs themselves remain stable over time, as does the job to be done. This leads us down the path to unmet needs. So this is a third step in our process to figure out, well, of all these different needs, which are unmet? Now, unmet can come in two forms. Unmet can be it's underserved, meaning it's important to customers and not well satisfied, or it can be overserved, meaning it's not important to customers, but well satisfied. Now, we want to understand where both of those situations exist because we believe that innovation is the process of devising solutions that get the job done better and more cheaply. So if we know where the market's underserved, we can figure out where to get the job done better. If we know where it's overserved, we can figure out where to get it done more cheaply. Now, the way we do that is quantitatively through research, where we take those statements, as you saw in the previous slides, 70, 80, 100 statements or more, we put them in a survey and we ask people to tell us, how important is it to you that you're able to minimize the time it takes to do X or minimize the likelihood that this happens? And given the products that you're using, how satisfied are you with your ability to do exactly that? What this gives us are two data points that allow us to figure out where the market's under and overserved. So this one example here, minimize the time it takes to get the songs in desired order for listening. That ends up getting plotted there because 81% of the population is telling us that that outcome is very or extremely important, yet only 30% of the population is telling us it's very or extremely satisfied. So the population is telling us it's important, not well satisfied. That gets a higher opportunity score. And what we're able to do is to plot all those different need statements on the graphic to figure out which outcomes are underserved and where you may want to focus to get the job done better, and where the market's overserved, where you may want to focus to get the job done more cheaply. It also points out where there's table stakes, and you may have heard this term before, but these are outcomes or needs that are very important, very satisfied. Don't mess them up, right? I guess there's a general message from there. Don't take the satisfaction away from any of these. They're too critical to the success of the product and they're expected. Well, let's go into the next section here, which I find remarkable as well. According to our research, over 80% of product teams also disagree on the best way to segment a market. Again, this probably isn't surprising to you. Think about the way you segment markets. Is it around personas? Is it around use cases, demographics, psychographics, attitudes, behaviors? Again, through a company lens, it's not necessarily clear how to best define market segments, but through a jobs to be done lens, it becomes much more clear. The way we think about this is if the goal is to discover segments of customers with different unmet needs, then the best way to segment a market is to find subsets of people with different unmet needs. In other words, let's just segment around the unmet needs. Let's not segment around a proxy for unmet needs like industry or a demographic or a psychographic. Let's just segment around the unmet needs. When preparing a meal, for example, half the market may struggle to overcook the meal, and the other half may not struggle at all. There's segments of customers that have different unmet needs, and we find this to be true in nearly every market. Now, most companies can't segment around unmet needs because they don't agree on what a need is, they don't agree on what the needs are, and they don't agree on which needs are unmet. So it becomes impossible. But with these three pieces of information, you can make it a reality. So the way we do this, think about it like this. You've got 100 people taking the survey. A third of the sample tell us that outcomes 10, 20, and 30 are really important and unsatisfied. Another third of the sample think that outcomes 40, 50, and 60 are really important and unsatisfied. Another third think other outcomes are really important and unsatisfied. So using factor and cluster analysis, we can quite literally put people into these segments based on what they're telling us is important and unsatisfied. And we can find segments of people with different unmet needs. From there, we can go on to profile to figure out, well, who are these people? Why do they have different unmet needs? Why are they different from each other? Right? You could think of these as statistically valid needs-based personas, if you will. Personas not based on demographics or psychographics, but quite literally based on the fact that these groups of people have different unmet needs. Because I think that's why companies try to develop personas to begin with. They're making the assumption that this persona has a different set of needs than this other persona. But again, that's often guesswork. The way to validate this is to segment around the unmet needs and be certain that these people do have different views on which needs are unmet. Again, taking the guesswork out of innovation. Aligning the organization around a shared understanding of customer needs is transformational. And I've seen this time and time again, where even through a 2 or 3 day workshop, teams can go from not agreeing to what a need is to seeing from their customers what the needs are and figuring out which needs are unmet. And going from that position where they don't agree on what a need is to they all agree on what the needs are, which are unmet, allows the organization to head in a direction all aligned, right? And this is what companies often struggle to do. There's often butting heads between marketing and sales and development, R&D, and so on, because everyone has a different interpretation of what a need is. It's not as if there's any bad motives. Everyone's trying to better satisfy customers' needs, but they just don't define them the same way. They don't agree on what they are. Therefore, they can't agree on the solutions and what to go pursue. This, of course, makes innovation much more difficult and unpredictable. So again, to summarize the process, we define a market, but we don't define a market as a product or technology or vertical. We define a market as a group of people trying to get a job done. Then we define customer needs, but not as exciters and delighters or specifications and requirements or features or solutions. We define needs as the metrics that people use to measure success when getting a job done. And when it comes to unmet needs, we don't guess at them, we quantify them to figure out from a customer perspective, are there underserved customers and overserved customers along different dimensions. When it comes to segmentation, we don't segment around personas or use cases or verticals or demographics. Why? Because those are proxies for segments of people with different unmet needs. Let's just go segment around the unmet needs, get to the answer directly. Now, with this information, you can then answer so many different questions because the entire organization is dependent on a solid understanding of customer needs. So from there, you can formulate a whole series of strategies. So for example, the sales team can improve its sales strategy and come up with sales techniques that more closely connect with what the customer is trying to accomplish. Marketing can better position their products, like in that Quartus example, where they gain market share simply by repositioning what they already had. You can improve your existing products based on understanding which of those outcomes are unmet. You can find gaps in the portfolio, like Quartus did with the stent. You can find different strategies to pursue, identify opportunities, see how big they are, see if people will pay more for them. From this, you can evaluate your pipeline to see if products in your pipeline are going to get the job done any better. You can figure out which M&A and R&D investments to make, and so on. A lot of companies these days, too, are using this insight to drive their digitalization strategies. And obviously, digitalizing is simply a solution or a new way to do what customers are doing before. We just want to help people get their jobs done better. So applying it in that direction can certainly help drive growth through digitalization as well. The way I like to think about this, and we talk about this all the time internally, and this really excites me. Outcome-driven innovation puts your company on the most efficient path to growth. Now, what I mean by that is, if you can figure out what are the fewest number of things you can do to have the greatest impact on the biggest customer population, wouldn't you do that? That's the most efficient path to growth. So if you knew there were 5 unmet needs that were unmet across 100% of the population, you may want to focus on those first, and then go after the 10 unmet needs, for example, that are underserved in 80% of the population, and then the 7 unmet needs that are underserved in 60% of the population, and so on. Working your way down the set of outcomes in the most efficient manner so that you're creating more value, the most value you possibly can by taking the actions that you're taking. And this becomes possible using this approach. I like thinking about it like this, where you identify your opportunities up front, and your goal over the next 5, 10, 20 years is to satisfy those opportunities. Again, it may come by better positioning what you have, improving what you have, filling gaps in the portfolio, making the right investments in R&D and M&A to get more of the job done, and so on, but eventually getting the job done perfectly. So this is the path, the most efficient path to growth. I want to tie this back up in the end here, talking about how it drives planning, development, marketing, and more. We talked about the innovation process, but it's not just the front end of innovation, but it certainly includes that, right? Up front, you have a job executor who's trying to get a job done. They define the market. Planning has to conceptualize a solution that gets the core functional job done significantly better. It requires them to understand the outcomes on the core job, discover the unmet needs, brainstorm solutions, and create the product strategy. But of course, it doesn't end there. But at least at this point here, you have a concept that's going into development that you know is going to win in the marketplace. Of course, if you can design it correctly and launch it correctly. But innovation comes into play here as well. For all the UX, CX folks in the audience, you're tasked with designing products that will satisfy the unmet needs that are discovered up front in the process, but also you have to design the product in such a way that executes what we call the consumption chain jobs, where the product's easier to install and set up and interface with and maintain and repair and upgrade and so on. So understanding the consumption outcomes, which are unmet, come up with ideas that address them, becomes your CX strategy. And the same thing is true at the back end. A third customer that needs to be addressed is the buyer of the product, or the purchase decision maker. In many B2B markets, the purchase decision maker and the job executor are two different people. So you're creating value for the job executor down here by helping them get their job done better, but you're helping the purchase decision maker get their job done better by appealing to them along a number of financial dimensions. So up here, we're taking the same ODI process, plugging in financial outcomes, figuring out which are unmet, coming up with the solutions, creating the go-to-market strategy. So you can see how a single innovation process can be used across the organization, and a single mindset can be adopted to help drive innovation across the organization in a very systematic fashion. Again, ODI infusing the mindset that's easy to understand, establishing a common language, enabling teams to share an understanding of customer needs, removing the guesswork and opinion from the process, and applying it across the board, like the medicines company had done, leads to this increase in success by 5x. So I'm going to stop there. That is everything I have. David, I know you're going to come back on with a few questions, and then we can get questions from the audience as well.
That's great. And first of all, thanks so much, Tony, for a great talk. Really appreciate your time joining us virtually here in Dublin today. So thanks again. Yeah, so one thing maybe just for myself, I see 3 questions in the Q&A panel. And again, folks, please add any questions you have into the Q&A panel. I think you touched on it slightly around jobs maps. I think I've seen in one of your books around kind of like how to map out those jobs to be done. Would you be able to share, like, what does that type of visualization look like in terms of making all those jobs visible?
Yeah, it's a great question. We didn't have job maps until the early 2000s. So prior to that, we would just go collect outcomes, and we'd have our list of 100 outcomes, and then we would try to get them in order, right? And so after doing hundreds of those, we're slow to pick up on the pattern here, but after doing hundreds of them, we realized that they followed a certain order where there was always a define or planning step up front. Then you had to go gather inputs and then organize the inputs and then confirm that everything was set. Then you would execute the job and monitor the execution, make modifications, and conclude. So we published an article in HBR in 2008 describing the job map. And what it does is it just helps us to organize the steps in the job and put in that intermediate level, like, because you have the high level job the customer's trying to get done. But before you get to the outcomes, if we just knew what all those steps were up front, before we dug deep into each step, it just saves a tremendous amount of time. So now when we do our customer research, we'll verify with customers first, what is the job to be done? And before we go to any outcomes, we may spend 4 or 5 interviews just getting the job map right. So we know very specifically in which order, what are you trying to do along each step of the way. And a job map is not a process map. So it's not laying out what people are doing. it's laying out what they're trying to do. And I know that sounds like a subtle difference, but it changes what you're going to write down completely. It's often the complete opposite, because what we're trying to do is define what people are trying to do in need space or
Mm,
problem space as opposed to solution space. And I would argue that when you write out a process map and what people are doing, it's all in solution space. You can see what
mm,
they're doing, but what are they trying to do?
yeah.
Like you can watch somebody, the anesthesiologist staring at their screen in the surgical suite, and you say, "Yep, they're monitoring the surgery." Well, what are they looking for? What they're trying to do is to maintain the patient's blood pressure and heartbeat at a normal level, right?
Mm,
They're trying to get something done. We want to know what that is, not what they're doing.
mm.
So I think drawing that distinction is one of those hurdles you have to overcome, moving from solution space to need space.
Perfect. Yeah, thanks. Okay, so folks, just going to jump to the Q&A. I have a few in there already. And first one from Margaret. So from a change management perspective, any advice on introducing ODI to an organization, for example, using pilot, etc.?
Sure. Yeah. So we have programs that are doing exactly this, and some organizations are more open than others. We could say it like that. Some companies have well-established innovation processes. Their ideas first. They think about innovation as idea management. Um, that that's going to require a bit more effort to convince folks like that to take on an ODI approach to innovation. And it usually starts with education around mindset shift, which is a lot of what I try to do here today. It's just, if you can get people to understand that there's a different way to look at innovation and open their minds to something different than an ideas first approach,
Mm,
then that's the first step. Now, once you open the idea that there is a better way, then and we've used ODI on studying this exact job. It's building an innovation capability. We have a job map for this. I don't have it loaded here. I should, but and what you have to do once you recognize the need for a new process, then you have to go find that process. And that's when we introduce ODI to organizations. And then they have to understand how the process is going to work for them, who needs to learn it. Interestingly enough, everybody does not have to become an ODI practitioner. There's value in doing the process, of course, but there's more value to be gained by using the data that comes out of the process. So as a product manager, should they be an ODI practitioner, or should they be the champion that's taking that data and making sure that the marketing value proposition is designed around the unmet needs, that
mm,
ideation is being executed around the unmet needs, that R&D decisions are being focused around the unmet needs, and so on. They're more directing how to use the information rather than getting the information. So I like
mm,
drawing that distinction. And so there's training programs for helping people do the process and be practitioners. Then there's training to help product managers, marketing managers, and others use the data to make better decisions, as we've described today. So it's typically done with a couple of pilots. And in the back of the book, this one here, Jobs to be done, I do talk a little bit about how to roll it out inside the organization. But if you want more insight on that too, of course, you can reach out to us and we can answer some of the questions that you might have.
It's great. And thanks, Margaret. Yeah, definitely would agree. It's a mindset shift as well. Bit of change management there. So thanks, Margaret, for the question. And just the next one, do you see any similarity between outcome-driven innovation and OKRs?
Yeah, so I do. So OKRs, of course, have a little bit newer. Microsoft has been using them for a bit. But OKRs, the concept is similar, but OKRs generally aren't applied to product management. And you can make the case, in fact, we're working on an article that makes this case, that outcomes are the perfect OKR for innovation. You can say it like that, but it depends on how you define OKRs. Just like there's no agreed on definition of what a need is. If you look up definitions on what OKRs are as well, they're all over the place, and people are trying to apply them to lots of different things, and they're writing them in different ways with different syntax and so on. So I feel like the OKR space is trying to get to where we are. Right? And we've perfected these statements for this application. I think you can use OKRs for many different applications. I don't think you'd write the input exactly the same for different applications. I think it might be different. And I would say outcome statements are the perfect OKR for the innovation process.
Cool. Thanks, Tony, and thanks for the question. Just another one. How should organizations think about how they incentivize product teams? So that's definitely a big topic when taking an ODI approach.
Yeah, well, I think they need to incent them across a couple of fronts. One is like short-term wins and then longer-term wins. When using the approach, the first thing you want to do is just get on the same page as to who your customer is. And I bring that up because a lot of times there's multiple customers. There's the buyer, there's the product lifecycle support team, there's the job executor. Everyone gets an equal weighting. It's confusing as to which customer has what types of needs and where they should be considered in the grand scheme of things. But going back to this slide here, what I would argue is that your job executor is going to give you the inputs you need in order to conceptualize a winning product up front. The product lifecycle support teams should be focusing on those folks who have consumption chain jobs and outcomes to help develop the product. And then the marketing team should focus on the purchase decision maker to help build out this strategy. So I think all these different things need to be coordinated in order for this to work effectively.
Okay, perfect. Maybe just one more question. In terms of reviewing those needs and outcomes, how often do you recommend that that teams review those?
So once you have that first set, like that set of surgical outcomes that I showed you, they're in pretty good shape, right? So what we do recommend, though, is to re-quantify them maybe every 2 years or so, or if some shift changes in the marketplace, or if a new competitor joins the field, you could take the same survey you may have had originally and find 100 users of the new product, the competitor product, have them tell you which needs are important and unsatisfied, find out the strengths and weaknesses of that one product and incorporate that into your decision-making process. Short of that, like if the market's steady state, we've had companies not refresh the data for 10 years. I don't recommend that, but I'm just saying that that's not uncommon, right? I would say quantitatively, address it every 2 to 5 years. Qualitatively, you should always be on the lookout for like a better outcome statement. Maybe you could improve them, but generally speaking, once you have that down, they're pretty stable over time.
Okay, that's great. So folks, we're nearly out of time. Tony, just for if anyone wants to learn more about your work, where can they find out that?
Yeah, so there's a number of places. Of course, you can go to our website at strategy.com. That's one. There's sections there for jobs to be done and ODI. The book on the left is free as an ebook and an audiobook at jobstobedonebook.com. So that's a great place to go. I also have a Medium site at jobstobedone.com. That is pretty interesting and has some of my personal feelings about innovation. And of course, the original book is What Customers Want, which was updated with this other book. But I have that one right here. I was just reading through it again, and I thought, this is from 2005, but it's still not. It's not a horrible read. It's still okay, and so that might be a source you may want to go to as well.
That's great, and we'll post links to all those resources on our Meetup community page as well. Listen, thanks so much again, Tony, for joining us all the way from Florida today. We really appreciate your time, and hope to see you in person at some stage in the future.
That'd be great, David. We could get a pint down here in Florida. Looking
Absolutely,
forward to that.
Yeah. I look forward to it. Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Yeah. Bye-bye.